Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Monday, February the 6th. And welcome to our commentary. I got to make a little correction about something I said the other day. I want to thank my friend Nestor, who watches our show, and I want to thank him for correcting me. You know, the other day I said, in reference to the balloon that was up in the air, the white balloon that we shot down on Saturday. I made a reference to Sputnik, and Sputnik was, of course, the Soviet satellite that went up in 1957 that really shook up public opinion around the world because nobody expected the Soviets to do that or the Russians. So they put Sputnik up in the air, and I said during the video that Sputnik was the size of an orange or a grapefruit. Well, my good friend Nestor sent me an email saying, no, it wasn't really the size of an orange. It was more like the size of a beach ball. So that's a lot bigger, obviously, than a grapefruit. So thanks to Nestor for the correction that Sputnik was not the size of an orange or a grapefruit. It was actually the size of a beach ball. So a little bit bigger to say the least. Well, we're going to be talking a lot about the balloon with our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. We'll be doing our weekly podcast later Monday, and that will be up on the blog late afternoon, early evening. You can catch it on my blog or over on the website at Blog Talk Radio, or if you have Twitter now, you can watch it over there. I've been posting on Twitter here the last month or so, ever since Elon Musk bought Twitter. I'm following Twitter. So far, it's interesting. We'll see if how Twitter develops over time. So today, the week in review with my good friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Well, I have a post over at the American Thinker that I want to bring to your attention Monday morning. A post about Beto O'Rourke. I'm sure all of you remember Beto O'Rourke. He ran for governor, ran for the U.S. Senate, even ran for president. In the last 5 years, this man has run for 3 offices. He ran against Senator Cruz in 2018. Actually, that was a great campaign that he ran in 2018. He came very close to winning that campaign against Senator Cruz. And then in 2020, he decided to run for president, and that turned out to be a disaster, even though he had a great start in that nomination. And then in 2022, he was just defeated by Governor Abbott by 10, 11, 12 points here in Texas. Well, I bring up Beto O'Rourke because he has just been signed up to teach a few classes up at the University of Chicago. Now, I wish him well. Um, I think we need to hear from a lot of different people, and he's one of the many people we have to hear from. I guess he's gonna teach a class on American politics. So we'll see what he has to say. I suggested some topics to Beto in my post, like, for example, should a candidate for the U.S. Senate receive so much money from outside his home state? Should a candidate for the presidency make a bunch of outrageous statements like, I'm going to take your AR-15 away, and so on? So I suggested a few topics. The course will be, I guess, this spring at the University of Chicago. So if you're up there and you take the class, I wish you well. And send me a note and tell me what you think of his class. He's a pretty dynamic fellow, so I'm sure he can be a good speaker and have a good class. So we wish him well. But as I wrote, I am actually happy that he's a professor at the University of Chicago. I'd rather have Beto O'Rourke teaching at the University of Chicago than serving as our U.S. Senator, our U.S. Governor, and God forbid, candidate for president of the United States. So good luck to Beto O'Rourke. Well, February the 6th is a fascinating day to remember 2 of the most interesting personalities of the last 100 years. One is Ronald Reagan, and the other one is Babe Ruth. Now, of course, Ronald Reagan and Babe Ruth, Reagan in politics, Ruth in baseball, were both born on this day, February the 6th. Ruth was born in 1895 in Baltimore, and he became, of course, the great baseball player. And Reagan was born in Tampico, Illinois. A lot of people don't know that he was actually born in Illinois. Most people associate Reagan with California, but he lived in California most of his life, of course. He was governor of California as well, but he was actually born in Tampico, Illinois, which is, I don't know where that is, but it's a small town somewhere in Illinois. And these two men, besides sharing a birthday, these two men, I think, were great achievers, and they both came into the picture. Ruth in the early 1920s and Reagan in the 1970s, the 1980s. And they both came into the picture, and they had a lot to do with saving their industry. Ruth came in 1920, and he was originally with the Red Sox, and he was traded to the Yankees, but it was with the Yankees that he became the big player that we know him as. And in fact, Ruth, really by all accounts, he saved the game of baseball. The game of baseball had a terrible scandal in the 1919 season with the White Sox and the mafia and organized crime and stuff like that. And the game was on the verge of collapse, financially, that is. And Babe Ruth came in, started hitting home runs, and the parks were full again. So Babe Ruth literally saved the game of baseball by putting people back in the seats, which is what he did quite well. He would sell out many places wherever he would play. Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, and I would argue saved the country from all of the terrible policies of the 70s. But also, it wasn't just the policies. It was the negativity that we had in the late 70s, that terrible time in the late 70s. And Reagan came in the 1980s. He put some policies in place. But his biggest achievement, and I'll say this over and over and over again, his biggest achievement was turning around American public opinion, making Americans feel happy again about their country. Patriotism came back, and the flag, and there was a great deal of pride in the U.S. military, and all of that because of Reagan's, not just his policies, but his amazing ability to communicate a message to the American people. So I've always argued that Ronald Reagan and Babe Ruth, in many ways, saved Reagan the politics, and Ruth, of course, the game of baseball. And they were both great personalities. You might argue that Ruth was a little bit more exciting, you might say, maybe a little bit more eccentric than Ronald Reagan, but nevertheless, they were both great personalities in their fields. And as I say, baseball and Babe Ruth are synonymous. And I think politics and Ronald Reagan, particularly communications in Ronald Reagan, are phenomenal. You know, Ronald Reagan changed the way presidents communicate. And every president since Reagan has followed. For example, the way he would deliver the State of the Union by pointing out somebody in the audience. That started with Reagan. And every president since has followed that tradition. So we remember today Babe Ruth, born on this day in 1895. He passed away very young in 1948. He died of cancer. And Ronald Reagan, who was born on this day in 1911, passed away in 2004. Just both great personalities of our times. This week, we also remember the Beatles, because it was this week in 1964 that what came to be known as Beatlemania really hit the United States. First of all, it started with the song "I Want to Hold Your Hand" that became number one this week on Billboard. And for the next 3 months, a song by the Beatles was number one on Billboard. I mean, it was amazing. The domination of the radio and the charts, the charts that we saw with the Beatles was something that we had not seen really since Elvis. So that happened, began this week in 1964 with the song "I Want to Hold Your Hand" that became number one on Billboard USA and across the country. You know, radio stations at the time were playing nothing but the Beatles. The fans could not get enough of the Beatles, and you had several Beatles albums that were released really in the first half of 1964, and then of course that movie "A Hard Day's Night" was released in the summer of 64. But it all started this week with I Want to Hold Your Hand, and something also very important that happened this week, and the Beatles. And that's when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show. They were on the Ed Sullivan Show February the 9th. And that was one of the most amazing television shows ever. Uh, According to what I've read, something like 70% of the television sets in the United States were watching the Beatles. Now, remember, it's a totally different time than it is now. Back in 1964, there was generally one television in the house. Usually you had a television set in your living room if you had a family, or if you have an apartment or something, you might have it in your bedroom or whatever. But there was one television per house. And to have 70% of the television sets, watching the Beatles, I mean, that was an amazing. I don't think we've ever had that kind of penetration before. We've had larger audiences in terms of people watch, let's say, a Super Bowl or a World Series game, or maybe a World Cup game, particularly international audiences. But in the United States, that night, the Ed Sullivan Show had just the most amazing share of the television audience in the United States. And that night, they had two performances on the Ed Sullivan Show. And by all accounts, everybody who saw them was turned on by the Beatles. And the people who were lucky enough to get in, even today, they'll talk about the energy that was in that hall where Ed Sullivan used to do his show. So we remember Ronald Reagan, who was born on February the 6th. We remember Babe Ruth, who was born on February the 6th. And we remember the Beatles this week in 1964. And the amazing thing called Beatlemania that just dominated the country for a long time. I mean, it was just remarkable, the impact that they had on music that year. Thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas. Don't forget to catch our interview with Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. We'll have that on the blog all week. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great day from Dallas, Texas.